In this story, I'm going to talk about how my conscious conception of my firstborn, my pregnancy journey, and my birth experience radically transformed me and healed my relationship to being a woman, to my sexual and creative power, and radically expanded my consciousness. My son was born 15 years ago now in 2009 in the Atlantic Ocean. The experience of choosing to conceive him and my pregnancy and then my birth experience was one that was a profound spiritual awakening. Just before consciously conceiving my son, I had discovered a couple of books with a person who would become a very important spiritual mentor in my partner at the time's life. It was one of those moments when I was standing in Barnes & Noble and I was looking at the bookshelf, and I don't even remember why we were standing in this particular section, but I remember seeing these two books as if they were glowing, and I pulled the book from the shelf, and the name was The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. I'd never heard of the Flower of Life at that point. I did not know anything about sacred geometry or the particular esoteric teachings that I was about to delve into. I looked at the table of contents, and it seemed all over the place to me. And I thought to myself, how is a person going to be able to write about all of these concepts in such a short book? How can they effectively talk about all of these concepts in such a short book? That was my first question in my mind. I continued to flip through the book, and I don't even remember in this moment why, but it was 100% clear that I needed to buy this book and read it. This was from a place of deep knowing in myself. And so we purchased the book, and I devoured it. I stayed up all night reading it until I was finished. From beginning to end, straight through, nonstop. Everything else fell away. Talk about binging. I seriously binged this information. Something woke up in me that I didn't even realize was dormant. Logically, the things that the author, Drumvalo Melchizedek, was talking about seemed absurd to me. I am someone who's both a scientist and logical and uses mental deduction to understand this experience of life. And I also 100% believe in magic, especially now. At that time, I believed in it too. And I had a strong intuition. And I say that with hesitation because what that means to me now is so vastly different than what it meant to me back then. Back then, what intuition meant to me was that sometimes I would know things and I would trust myself enough to follow something even though it might not make sense. And it was as simple as that. I had this underlying faith in things working out, even though maybe in the external circumstances in a given moment, that might not be the logical explanation or seemingly logical pathway. When I read this book, I felt a deep, deep knowing in my heart that the concepts that he was talking about and the history of where humans came from and our purpose here on the planet at this time was true. I don't know if I believed every single word, and it didn't matter. I was receiving an energetic transmission that was activating me and waking me up to a deeper truth of who I am. And it had a profound and rapid ripple effect on my life. My partner also began reading the book and devoured it as quickly as I did. So we experienced this spiritual awakening together. I believe, retrospectively, it was one of the greatest reasons for our coming together, and such an incredible gift that we offered one another, supporting this soul illumination that occurred for both of us. We began to do these particular meditation practices that were inner technologies, I'll call them, to connect different parts of oneself. For example, the heart with the pituitary gland, with higher states of consciousness, and to be consciously working with not just developing an energetic awareness, or an awareness that I have an energetic body, and to start to sense the more subtle movements of energy through my body, my bodies, my energetic and physical bodies, but to activate very specific pathways within the body and the energy field. This was the beginning of me consciously connecting or even hearing about ascended masters and different angels, and starting to work with these other consciousnesses to be able to reveal to me curiosities I had about this whole new world of experience, this whole new perception of looking at what it means to be in a body, what it means to be alive, what consciousness is. It was such a profound and transformative time in my life. And I believe that the soul, who is my son, is the one that guided me to this book on that day. The one who helped light up the spine of the text so that I would gravitate toward it and begin to read and open my mind, open my heart, expand my consciousness to prepare to receive him, to parent him, for both of us to parent him. A couple of weeks after we read this book, there were actually two books, Volume 1 and Volume 2, so both of the books. We went to a workshop with someone who had been studying these technologies through meditation practices. And it was over the new year in 2008. We had an amazing experience. And that was the last time that I menstruated. A couple of weeks later was the first time that I and we, as a couple, began exploring practices of consciously moving sexual creative energy through the body. And in this case, we were doing it, looping it together. I would come to find out later these were tantric practices. At the time, I didn't know this word. I didn't know the history, the ancient history of practices for moving sexual creative energy through the body and using it, channeling it, focusing it in different ways. There was one specific mention in the Flower of Life books that was from an Egyptian lineage that we were practicing, and it was ankhing. You may have seen the Ankh symbol, the symbol for eternal life, and it was spoken about in the Ancient Secret of Flower of Life books through this lens of the symbol of the Ankh being how you breathe and move sexual creative energy through the body to consciously procreate. And it was in this way that my son Azaza was conceived. I knew for sure that I was pregnant with him about a week and a half after conception, when I was completing a multiple session tattoo series. And I remember it being an excruciating experience. The intensity of getting the tattoo it far, far surpassed my tattooing experiences previously. And I was in the bathroom in this tattoo parlor, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was pregnant. Throughout the duration of my pregnancy, my partner and I were deeply immersed in meditation practices that we had learned from our spiritual mentor. We would spend a few hours a day in meditation and listening and deciding what we were going to do each day based on what was coming through during our meditation time. This was a time for me of cultivating my skills of deep inner listening, and I was beginning to sense and feel things in a deeper way than I had remembered feeling before. And so one of the first things that felt clear to us was that we wanted to to connect more with crystals in the mineral kingdom. Neither one of us had had a particular connection with crystals prior to this time. So we decided to move from Massachusetts to the Southwest. In particular, we spent some time in Santa Fe. And during the time in the Southwest, we began to visit different crystal and rock shops. And we would purchase different crystals that we felt drawn to. We would sleep with them under our pillows, and we would meditate with them, and we would listen for the messages that they had coming through, or start to sense and feel the particular energetic quality that came from them, or to start to feel what type of healing energy they might emit. We spent months doing this and became avid lovers of crystals and crystal collectors. Also during this time, we spent a couple of weeks in Sedona and in the Grand Canyon area with our spiritual mentor, and it was a gathering of many indigenous elders that were from around the world, and we were space holders for this inner circle of indigenous wisdom that was spoken about for weeks. We traveled up to the lands that were surrounding and at the Grand Canyon with this whole tribe of people, and received the messages and transmissions about the earth from these elders. Every day, day in and day out, this was what we did for a period of a few weeks. Our journey led us to Mount Shasta, where we again had profound heart-opening and consciousness-expanding experiences as we spent time on the land, the mountain, and meditating on the mountain. These are spiritual communities that exist that we had not experienced before. These were first-time experiences for us. All the while, my belly is growing and getting bigger, and I'm rapidly changing. When I was just 3 months pregnant, when we were in the Southwest, I was meditating one day with a crystal near my belly in my hands, and I heard a voice that said, "I am Azaza, the nameless light of the central sun." When I came out of my meditation that day, I knew that this was the name of our baby, that his soul was speaking to me and telling me what to call him. At the time, we had thought he was a girl. And so I asked my partner what he thought of the name Azaza, and we decided immediately that that was the name we were choosing for our child. There were so many magical experiences that happened during my pregnancy. It was such a profound shift from how I had been living my life to listen to my intuition and guidance that was coming through during meditations for how to guide each moment of every day. One day, when I was 6 months pregnant, we had been camping in Zion National Park in southern Utah with some friends, and we went on a very long hike. It was about an 11-mile hike, and it was getting to the point where we needed to decide where we were going to do the birth. And I had this knowing inside of me that I wanted to give birth in the water, that if someday I were to have children, I wanted to give birth in the water. Ever since I was a child, I had this idea that it felt like the most normal thing in the world to give birth in the water, and specifically the ocean. And even though I had never heard of anyone doing this, I thought to myself, why wouldn't someone do that? Like, why wouldn't that be a place that was normal to give birth? At some point, I was sharing this with someone and their face lit up and they said, have you ever seen the Russian water birth videos where they do give birth in the ocean? And I got very excited because I hadn't heard of anyone talking about this before. And they showed me this video. And my heart just lit up. And I was like, yes, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I want to do. And so when we were on our hike in Zion, and I was several months along at this point, I knew that it was time to decide, am I going to do an ocean birth or not? Because if I am, we need to decide where we're going and start to have some sort of idea of what our plan was going to be. There were definitely moments when I was still wanting to figure some stuff out and not have every single moment be unfolding in full presence. And at this stage in my pregnancy, I wanted to at least know which part of the country we were going to be in. And so romantically, I had this idea that I wanted to go to Hawaii. I had never been to Hawaii before, and I knew that staying in the United States, southern Florida or Hawaii were really the only options given the temperature of the water, and my due date was in October. So my partner and I were at the end of our hike in Zion, and we had asked the question about officially deciding to do an ocean birth or not, and wanting to have some sort of clarity or sign. And we paused, and all of a sudden the clouds started swirling in this vortex shape, and our friends that we were with were quite a bit behind us, so they didn't see this. It was just him and I. And we paused and just stared at the sky for however many seconds or minutes it went on, and then looked at each other and said, did you just see that? Did you just see that? It felt like we were hallucinating. And we knew from that moment that our decision had been made. During the beginning of August, we decided that we were going to go to southern Florida. We had hit many roadblocks with the idea of going to Hawaii, and so it was very clear to us that the path was southern Florida. So we took a road trip to southern Florida, and my dear friend joined us for the experience of road tripping and then also living down there until a few weeks post-birth. And we arrived in southern Florida, and I had spoken to a midwife on the phone, a few different midwives on the phone, telling them what we wanted to do. And there was one midwife in particular that it felt very clear was the answer was the one for us. Her name was Mary Harris, and she is an absolute angel. As soon as we got to Florida, we scheduled our first meeting with midwife Mary. And one of the things that was so profound working with Mary, and it was evident in this meeting, was her magnitude of trust in a woman's body. To her, it didn't matter what the details were going to be, where we were living, what beach we wanted to do this on. All of that stuff, she said, will fall into place. And to just trust the process. It was music to my ears because the other midwives I had spoken to were either outright saying this is an awful idea, or they were coming in with a lot of fear. But what about pollution? What about storms? What about this? What about that? And while all of those details made logical sense, it was not where I wanted to spend my time or attention in these last stages of my pregnancy. I was hearing from pretty much everyone outside of me, besides my partner and midwife Mary, reasons why it was not a good idea to do this. A lot of fear and worry. And so one of the choices that I made was to pull back from who I was sharing this with at that stage in my pregnancy and really focus on cultivating a safe and expansive end of term. We settled in a small apartment in Coconut Grove in Miami for the end stages of my pregnancy. And we did have a backup plan and a beach chosen. The backup plan was at friends of our friend's house who had a beautiful pool with an outdoor screen and lots of flower gardens all surrounding it. And we created a huge, beautiful altar there. Our plan was to go to the beach that was nearby their house and maybe labor at her house and then go to the beach to have the baby and then come back. And as often happens with birth, things did not go according to plan. My water broke, but I did not go into labor. And given that there can be risk of infection if the mother does not go into labor within a certain time period after the water breaks, it was important for my labor to get started. Midwife Mary's office was in Hollywood, Miami, which was a few hours away from where we had planned to have the birth. And so we found ourselves at our friend's mom's condo on Hollywood Beach in Florida on Columbus Day weekend, a busy holiday weekend, at Mary's office, deciding what we were going to do. She pulled out every trick in the book, from Chinese herbs to drinking castor oil to different teas. I did all of the different ways that she knew for how to start my labor without going to the hospital to do it. And I also resigned to that if we need to go to the hospital, we need to go to the hospital. Our dear friend, who is a very gifted healer and acupuncturist, was flying into Miami to come be with us. I was a week past my due date, and he thought that the baby would already be born and he would be coming to visit the baby. And it turns out I was not, and he ended up being a key player in my birth story. As soon as he landed, my partner picked him up at the airport and briefed him about what was going on, and I had still not gone into labor despite all of the different things that my midwife had tried. He had brought with him a golden needle, and he offered to do a session for me, an acupuncture session. So we got back to the condo, and he put one needle in this point on my leg that apparently is known for initiating labor. And I don't know how much time passed, but it was not much time at all when we were walking outside in the evening on the beach and my labor had begun. This was around 8 o'clock at night on October 10th. I dozed off and fell asleep until around midnight. And at midnight, I woke up with the pangs of labor starting to become much stronger and closer together. At this point, I retreated into the master bathroom with the lights out, and it was dark, And my partner stayed in, there was this tiny little hallway with like a place to put on your makeup that separated the bedroom from the bathroom. It was very small and contained, and he stayed in there and held vigil and meditated for the next many hours to come, while I had shut myself in the bathroom, the small bathroom with all the lights out, and also went into deep meditation. And this was how I remained for my labor. For hours and hours, I was in a state of absolute bliss. I felt so deeply connected to my body. As the waves of labor would come, as the waves of contraction would ebb and flow, and my breath in perfect synchronized timing with it, I would doze off in between contractions and then wake up as I felt the wave coming. And one of my very wise friends who had already had a baby had told me that it's like surfing, and I loved surfing. And she said, if you catch the wave, you can ride the wave, but if you don't, you tumble in the undertow. And so I just had that in my mind, and I was surfing the waves all night in absolute ecstasy. There were a couple of moments when I missed the wave and I tumbled, and I could feel how people would associate contractions as pain. To me, I would not have put the word painful on my experience that I was having. I would say it was very intense sensation, but it wasn't painful. I was just fully open to receiving the waves as they came. At a certain point, deep in my laboring, I saw a little ball of white light that began circling my head, and my eyes were open in this dark room. And the ball of light was circling my head, and I heard this voice speak to me that said, "It's time. Are you ready for me?" And I said, "Yes." And the ball of light entered through the crown of my head, and immediately my body shifted into these intense surges of pushing energy, and my sounds coming out of my mouth changed. And the midwife, Mary, came in from the other room where she had been all night, and she said to me, "Kristen, do you want to go down to the ocean to have the baby?" And I looked at her, the first time in hours I'd seen or spoken to anyone. And I said, "I don't know. I just couldn't even, I was in such an altered state, I couldn't even think." And she said, "You came all this way to do this. Let's go." And she grabbed my arm, and I grabbed my glasses and I put them on, and we silently walked out. It was her, a backup midwife, me, my partner, and 3 dear friends who were like spiritual midwives. And we went from the 6th floor where the condo was down the hallway. It was the very early hours of the morning, still dark out, into the brightly lit elevator, down the elevator to the 1st floor, out through the garage, past the pool area, across the boardwalk. And in southern Florida, there are these decks that take you across the threshold of the buildings and boardwalk to the beach. And there are these like beach plum tree bushes that are up all around, that it's really a threshold that you cross. It certainly was for me in this moment. And I crossed the threshold, and I felt the ocean breeze, the warm ocean breeze hit my skin, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And I kept walking. And there was no one on the beach at this point because, like I said, it was the wee hours of the morning. And we went to the water, and as soon as my toes hit the water, the next contraction came on. Something I didn't mention was that the backup midwife told me, she was the only one who spoke when we, at least as far as I remember, when we were leaving the condo. And she said, "Whatever you do, Kristen, if you start to have a contraction, hold that baby in." So I did not have any contractions all the way down to the beach, but as soon as my toes hit the water, a contraction came. And we quickly walked into the water and there were waves and another contraction came, and my partner was on one side holding my elbow and one of my dear friends was on the other side, and they were helping to stabilize me. And we walked out deeper into the water. We had to get past the waves, and we walked out until I was in a place where the waves were not hitting me as hard and knocking me off. And I was in a position where I was squatted down, and they were each on each elbow with them squatting down, and then the midwife was in front of me with one hand on my hip and the other hand feeling the baby's head as it started to come. And then the backup midwife was holding both of the midwife's hips, stabilizing her. We had a birth triangle. I later found out from the backup midwife that the whole time surrounding our birth triangle, a ray was swimming around us. Oh my gosh, even just thinking about my memory of this, it's so visceral in my body, and the incredible amount of peace that I felt in between each contraction. We were all silent. And in those moments in between, I was just looking up at the stars. There was a half moon and Orion was shining brightly overhead. And then the wave would come. The contraction wave, not the ocean wave. And my breath and breathing was in perfect synchronicity. We were in the water for about 45 minutes. It was 6, I believe, rounds of contraction before Aziza fully emerged. And at that point, we quickly got out of the water. I was shivering. I was cold, and this was one concern that not Mary, but other midwives had told me, was that they were concerned about my temperature, my body temperature dropping too low. And so I had that planted in my mind, and I was shivering, even though I was fully peaceful and ecstatic while I was having this birthing experience. I also had the awareness that my body was cold. And so they wrapped Aziza in a towel really quickly and handed him to me and wrapped me in a towel. And we got out of the ocean and we went back upstairs, walking the steps, same steps that retracing our steps of coming down to the ocean. As we were walking away from the beach, the sun began to crack over the horizon, and there was a thin line of bright orange light behind me. The timing couldn't have been more impeccable for Aziza's arrival. As we got back up to the condo, I birthed a placenta and held a healthy, gorgeous baby, much to our surprise, boy. Walking through this portal of becoming a mother, of conscious conception, of the pregnancy journey, and of this birth changed me in the deepest of ways. Not only did I have the experience of birth and becoming a mom and connecting in this particular way with all of the other beings who had birthed throughout humanity and the animal kingdom, which that in and of itself was so powerful. But I had such a deep awakening of trust in my body and trust in myself as a woman, and deep, deep healing of my body as a woman, in a deepening and nearly unshakable trust in my inner knowing and in my intuition. Sometimes I can't believe how normal it is to give birth, in that there's the opportunity thousands, tens of thousands, maybe times a day for a person to go through this birth portal and have this experience of profound awakening and connection and timelessness and transformation, of knowing the incredible miracle that our body is, not only to grow this baby, but gosh, the power that we have that is so apparent in the birthing experience, it changes you. It changes a person. And I have the desire that every person on this planet gets to have some type of experience where their knowing of their creative power and the profound interconnectedness between the unseen worlds and our ability to communicate with the unseen worlds, and an absolute deep trust in knowing in our bodies and our bodies to do everything that it needs to create and keep creating life. Our bodies are life-giving vessels, and they know how to do that. It's hardwired into our DNA, into every cell. We don't have to control that. I guess that is what I want to leave you all with, is that my wish is that everyone gets to experience at least once in their life a depth of surrender that I experienced in this birthing journey.